Hello, Rose, and today we're going to be talking about equality and its immoral limits on dynamic processes and existential uncertainty. This paper is featured in Belonging Again, and ultimately is going to be asking if law can replace givens. Belonging Again talks a lot about the loss of givens, sociological givens that help us avoid existential anxiety. Lacan's the real and give us direction. Can law replace that? Can law have the functions of givens? Why or why not? And if we say no, then this would basically mean that givens are a result of culture, that the state cannot replace the society in this way, and that's kind of a Murray Rothbard point, that the state and society are different. So the paper is going to ultimately be asking that, and that's how it situates in the Belonging Again arc of thought. The opening point is that morality defines the parameters of equality in a society's morality defines to whom equality is extended. The limits of equality are immorality. If we define murder as wrong, then someone who commits murder is someone of whom we can say put in jail and quote-unquote discriminate against, and it not be discrimination. So you can kind of go, well, the murderer killed somebody, it's wrong to, it's immoral to kill like that, therefore you can justly discriminate against them. So the limits, we don't actually want a society where there's equality between, say, the murderer and the average person, because one, that would render equality meaningless and almost immoral, because you're not making distinctions at all between the moral and the good and the bad. It all gets mixed up in problematic ways. But then at the same time, there's a risk here, because who decides what's immoral and what's not? I do think it is extremely important, if the political discourse is to advance or to be useful at all, that people have to understand that when many political disagreements, you can't simply solve them by saying that one side is being immoral and the other side is being moral or discriminating or getting rid of freedom or stuff like that, because it's all relative to people's moral vision. And although the example with the murderer is quite clear, and most liberals and conservatives would agree, for conservatives, there are certain things that constitute being immoral that therefore, denying equality to would not be an immoral act. Whereas for liberals, they disagree on that definition of immorality. Therefore, it is an immoral act to say, deny certain people those rights. Now, there's a lot of issues that this go for. So let's take immigrants, right? Like if conservatives say, well, they crossed the border illegally, therefore it's illegal, therefore if we put them in a certain camp or deport them, that's not immoral because they broke the law, and if you break the law as such, then there is a warranted discrimination. Like it would be immoral and wrong to just randomly pick a person and send them out of the country. But for the conservative, if they cross the border illegally, well, then it's not necessarily immoral to deport the individual. Whereas someone who's more liberal may say, hey, conservative, can you imagine being born in Honduras or being born in the middle of these drug cartels and you're looking for a better life, and the legal immigration process is so complex and horrific. I mean, it's just completely untenable that most people in Central America who may not even have a very advanced education would be expected to go through that process. So they're desperate, so that's why they're going through the border. And considering that situation that they were put in, it's just simply the case that, yeah, sure, maybe it's illegal that they crossed the border the way that they did, but it's unjust to then deport them or send them home or to put them in jail, right? Therefore, that certain definition, that certain discrimination would be immoral. And so there you go, right? And then that's where the debate goes. We really have to think of political discussions as moral debates, and moral debates in a very deep sense, in a very substantive sense, where we have to take into account the entire worldview. If we do not do that, we're just simply going to be accusing one another of, say, denying freedom or denying justice or discriminating or not discriminating, and it's really going to fall on deaf ears because those terms only have meaning when situated in a certain vision of reality, and so you have to take into account the entire vision of reality. But of course, this opens a lot of doors, because how do you determine what visions of reality should be codified into law, which should be cultural, and so on and so forth? And that's where you then need an entire process of free exchange and debate and all of that different stuff. Well, then we get a problem because this becomes really complex, and how do you even maintain those things? And you have a very live system, and a live system means uncertainty, and if people can't handle uncertainty, well, then the only option may be totalitarianism or oppression or a very large state, and that's where you open potential problems. Now, another point the paper will make is this kind of interesting idea that if you have freedom, but you don't have the freedom to give up your freedom, there's a sense in which you have less freedom. In a society, there are laws, and so it's possible to break laws, and therefore it's possible to lose your freedom. And there is a sense in which this is actually a greater freedom than, say, being isolated in a forest where you must be free, because there is no social order. Now, that can be debated, but like in the forest, you must find food and shelter and take care of yourself. So you're kind of forced to be free that way, whereas in a social order, you don't have to be in the social order. You could leave the social order and be isolated in the mountains. So you have that, you could choose the that first thought experiment, that first situation that we described. But in a social order, it's interesting because you actually are free to give up freedom. You can break the law. Now, we can argue if the law is just or not, but the point is you have the choice to give up freedom. And there's actually a way in which this kind of honors human dignity. Now, the term dignity is difficult here. We were recently discussing at the net with Mr. Jockin and everyone the problems with that term, but if you grant it to me here, there is a way in which the choice to give up freedom is precisely an honoring of freedom, an honoring of humanity, where there's something to revere and to respect. And so a lack of law in anarchism can actually be alienating because freedom is something you're forced to have. Therefore, it loses meaning. So getting rid of law may not be the answer, right? But then, of course, if you have law, you enter into all of that trouble we talked about the first time, like how do you determine what law is good and what not, and all of that different stuff. But the first point is we can't be so quick to say getting rid of law is the answer, because that can create a certain alienating freedom. And there's good reason to think that that freedom is not something that people actually want, because so few people go off and live in true, utter isolationism. Now, you could say that, people could, and they don't. Maybe you can say it's not realistic for them to do, but they could, and they don't. You can join an Amish community if you want. You can be isolated, and people don't. And that's because people want modern conveniences or the internet or technology or things like that, which is not bad at all. No one's saying that's bad. But the moment you want, say, the internet, or you want highways, or you want restaurants, you need a legal framework, a structure to have people interact under those conditions fairly, etc. We have to get into what that term means, but if you grant it here. And then you have to have an economy of incentives to create the restaurant, to maintain the restaurant. Same goes with the internet and so forth and so on, and thus you end up in the need for a society. So, if you're going to have modern conveniences, you end up having law, because you end up having an economy, and if you have an economy, then you have the question of what is the fair operations of that economy, so on and so forth. But anyway, the first point is that law creates the freedom of giving up freedom, which then kind of honors freedom and makes it more meaningful. And then we have this issue where we need law, of which isn't a simile for morality, but tends to reflect morality to create desirable equality. Because if I had equality with murderers or terrible people, then there'd be equality. No one would be sent to jail. But it might not be an equality that I want, and it might be immoral, right? So law also creates the possibility of equality that is meaningful. Now, this is where we get into the question of what laws we want to have and not. Should, for example, you could argue that society discriminates in favor of people with high IQs or college education, and it's unfair to people who don't have high IQs. And therefore, people with high IQs should pay for universal basic income. Do you want to pass that law or not? Would that be a good law? Would it be an effective law? Would it be a practical law or not? Well, then we have to have a debate, right? We have to have a conversation. This is where you get into things like the free market. Dietrich McCloskey will talk about you have to have a market test because everyone thinks their product is a good product or their idea is a good idea, and even if it is not, so you need a test. And the market test is important because it's not like an election where you vote once every 4 years and then get represented. A market test is where every individual is constantly voting all the time based on ideas they have of what constitutes the good, and then it turns out they're bad ideas, so they buy a different product and so on and so forth. It is a radical system of testing and experimentation. And it's hard to talk about the market, though, so the paper will talk about free exchange, because when you talk about the free market, people hear capitalism, conservatism, and they get turned off. But you have to have some sort of system of constant free exchange. And this would also get you into, like, free speech, following Jonathan Rout's and Kindly Inquisitors, where if you don't have free speech, you're going to have a collapse of knowledge, because you have to have this constant testing of knowledge to determine what's good and what's bad and so on and so forth. And so it goes with a market. So you have to have these systems of a market to test what's good and what's bad. Now, once you talk about law, since that tends to be codified, and once you pass a law, it's hard to get rid of, this is much more stagnant, much more difficult to get rid of than, say, if you don't like the restaurant, you go to Olive Garden, you have a bad night, well, you don't have to go back. It's not, it's not difficult to never go back to Olive Garden or to buy a new, it may suck to have to buy a new computer, but if you buy a computer, it turns out to be bad, you can buy a new one with relative ease compared to, say, changing the law. So it is really, really important that when law is passed, of which we require to have the freedom to give up freedom, and so that you can have a meaningful society, and so you can have equality that's not bad, well, then it's really important to have a process of free exchange. And another reason, so that when you pass law, there's a higher probability it is actually good versus not, because it's gone through so much extreme testing. But another reason why you got to have free exchange is precisely so that people can more easily live with the results of that free exchange. One of the reasons we take science seriously, like the discoveries of science, is because the process of scientific investigation itself bestows upon the results a certain authority, a certain stability, a certain sense that, we can really trust these results. Even if they're wrong, they can easily be wrong, but the process, the investigation, gives us more existential stability with the results. Maybe not, and as you have the legitimization crisis that Habermas talks about, it becomes more difficult, but generally speaking, the process bestows a certain stability. Well, so it goes when law is passed after a period of free exchange and debate. The very fact that it takes 6 years to pass a certain law or to change the tax policy, and that people have discussed and so on and so forth, makes the results a little bit easier to live with. And if they're not easy to live with, then people can be existentially unnerved or rebel against the government or stuff like that. So you have to have this process for creating law so that people will live with the law or accept the law as opposed to revolt against the law, and also so that people feel like the law is fair. If there's not a process through which the law arose, people are more likely to question it. So the process of free exchange is important in that regard as well. The very fact that it arises, democratically at least, and so it goes with the market as well. Like if you go, the reason these laptops are sold at the store is because all the other models couldn't sell because people didn't want them. Like all of those make you feel like the products offered at the market are likely more good than not. And if the government is more democratic where the people participated, then you're likely to feel that the law serves the people more so than not. But of course, as capitalism goes in the direction of big corporatism, monopoly, so on and so forth, and as the state feels more separated from the people, this may not follow, but ideally, the process gives the results a feeling of existential stability. And if the process is not there, that can go away. And generally and hopefully, free exchange is a dynamic process spread across millions of individuals making millions, if not billions, of decisions that organically arise to a checked and balanced result that has a high likelihood of being best, or at least the best possible in this world that we can only recognize as likely best. We can't know for sure it's the best, we'd have to be God, but the very fact that the result emerged from a certain process creates confidence, and that's kind of the main point. Well, then this all begs the question, okay, we've made a point that free exchange is needed for existential stability. Well, can law give us givens? Can they restore belonging? And the issue is probably not, and they can't, because if I make it illegal, say, to not be Christian, for example, because I'm trying to restore Christian givenness in America, well, then I can always wonder if everyone around me is Christian because they want to be Christian or because they're afraid of breaking the law. And I myself can wonder if I'm Christian because I want to be Christian or not. Of course, law can also be totalitarian, but the issue is law creates existential uncertainty itself. If it is illegal to do something or to say something, then you can wonder if people don't say something because they really don't want to say something, because they believe it's, that it's morally incorrect to say that thing, or only because they're afraid of the law. The example in the book is if it becomes illegal to say, I hate you to someone, then weirdly enough, everyone around you can wonder if they don't say they hate you because they don't hate you or because it's only illegal to say that. And maybe it was only one person who ever said, I hate you to you, but just to stop that one person, you can change the very quality of your encounter with all people because now you've made it illegal to say, I hate you, right? And you can wonder, is everyone not saying it because they want to not say it or because they're afraid to say it? And that creates existential instability, and that creates a kind of question mark, and precisely that can cheapen and make all relationships feel fake. And for law to create givens, it would fall into that problem. Like if it forces everyone to share certain sociological paradigms or beliefs, then the meaning of those beliefs can feel cheap. Now, this could also mean, though, that the collapse of givens can actually lead to a world where, say, people being Christian feels more authentic, precisely because it's not given that they're Christian or Hindu or Muslim or atheist or whatever. So the loss of givens could be a kind of a Hegelian opportunity for a negation sublation of the historic age to something that's kind of deeper and more meaningful. But it could also, it's all contingent in Hegel. It also could overwhelm us and lead to a lot of trouble. But the main point is that law can't function as givens, because law does not create thoughtlessness like givens does. Givens created thoughtlessness, law does not. Law creates existential anxiety and an uncertainty, and the paper will talk about Baudrillard, the death of the real, the mixture of the simulation and the fake. You can't tell the difference anymore. Likewise, a culture that tries to operate according to law versus its own paradigms of operation that are emergent is not the same. That's going to be a society that is mostly the state. It is defined mostly by the state as opposed to its own cultures, and that will not create belonging. In fact, that's a risk of oppression. But if we don't realize this dynamic of equality and its immoral limits and its needing of law, then we're not going to. Then the likelihood of us having the right balance between law and culture, or for us to keep ourselves from overextending our worldview against all the other worldviews because we think they're immoral, the likelihood of substantive democracy, all this other stuff becomes much, much less. So it's very important to understand these dynamics and interplays between law, culture, the differences between law and culture, law and givens, what equality is, how it's always situated relative to morality. Same goes with human dignity, because if we don't understand those things, then we might look for a solution to the problems listed in Belonging Again that actually turns out to make our situation worse. For more by O.G. Rose, please visit ogrose.com, Twitter, Anchor, Instagram, YouTube, so on and so forth, and thank you so much for your time.